last video we saw Psalm 1 and we're going to look at Psalm 2. What we want to do is we want to see how it connects to Psalm 1. That's going to be the trick here. And I already gave you a couple of clues as to how they connect. One is the word blessed. They connect that way, also in theme. And the connection is that these two promises. The first promise, we saw the promise of the garden, which is represented in the tree that is planted near running water. And it's just very, very productive. And this next promise that we saw in the Old Testament was the promise that God was going to give us leadership, proper leadership, to keep us in the presence of God. Because as you know, human nature and people, they're just going to wander away from God. And to keep them from wandering away, good leadership keeps us back into the presence of God. So the first promise answers the problem of leaving God's presence, getting us back in. And then once we're in God's presence, we have to try to stay in God's presence. So God provides these two promises to keep us, bring us back into his presence, and then to keep us there. So that's what the second psalm is really addressing. And it looks at, and it begins by looking really at other nations that are against God and against God's plan. Of course, you don't want to go against God's plan, which is to bring people into God's presence. Now, the way to get rid of God's presence, of course, is to bring idols. Remember the first commandment, you shall not worship false gods. And so here, when you introduce false gods, you're really casting yourself out of the presence of God because you're no longer connected to God through your covenant, through your promise. God is the one that makes promises, but we also make promises to God. And our big promise to God is that I will always worship the one true God, and I won't turn to other gods. So when you turn your back against God, it means you're worshiping other gods. So these leaders outside are trying to conspire to bring in false worship, so that we turn away from God. And so this is it's a plot. It's an evil plot that wants to get us outside of the presence of God. And of course, God promised us leadership. So God says that God burst their bonds asunder and cast their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. I love that line because there is God up in heaven who had promised us leadership. You're trying to attack my promises. You're trying to stop my promises from being fulfilled. Good luck. Try doing that, right? And so God says that I will always be supply. I will always give you good leadership. And so he sends somebody that is like a son. This is a really powerful word, that I have set my king on Zion, on my holy hill. Now, Zion tradition is the word Zion is a wonderful word because what it represents is God's presence in the city of Jerusalem. It really represents God's presence. Another way of saying it, the Zion tradition, that God will be present. When God is present, we will exclaim our joy, and all the nations will come rushing towards us to want to be part of this joy, a part of God's nation. So that's what Zion represents. So think of it as the city on the hill, and all the other nations are drawn to this nation. So that's kind of the picture that you want to have when you hear the word Zion and that hill. So we have then he will speak to them in his wrath. That's the false, all of these bad leaders, and terrify them in the fury, saying, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. So the promise of this leader is like a son. And we're going to see this a lot in the New Testament. And these are the very words that God the Father says at Jesus' baptism, is that you are my son, my beloved son. So here it's the echoing of the second psalm. So many places in Scripture we're going to be seeing, especially in the New Testament, this leader is like a son to God, and they're very, very connected. Now, so we have a father-son relationship, which means the son is getting instructions from the father. And that's really, really important for a leader. A really good leader is going to be successful in bringing people back to God's presence by listening to God's voice, like a son listens to the father. Because what the father wants to do is give instructions to the son to carry on the father's legacy. It's like if you have a pizza shop, and you want to learn that, and your father makes the best pizza in town. You want to listen to the father's instructions to know how to make the best pizza so you can carry on the legacy. So here you have the son, like a son, listening to God, the Father, and to instructions to make sure that all the people remain in God's presence. And that way, that's how God is going to fulfill the promise, and how he's going to thwart the evil plot of all the bad leaders that are trying to stop us from worshiping the true God by bringing in false gods. So you see how it's all connected. And then at the very end of this, we hear that wonderful the wonderful phrase is, for those who are blessed are all those who take refuge in him. So again, that sense of blessedness, saying refuge in him, and it's turning back to God, finding God, being in the presence of God. That's what refuge really is finding. And so that the terror of all of these false leaders, these bad leaders, there's protection from all of them. So do not fear any bad leadership out there, because God will always give us leadership to keep us in God's presence. So this is a great way to start off the Psalter. Great way of starting up the book, because it sets up the theme. And the theme is going to continue throughout all of the Psalter, is going back. These prayers all have connection to God's promises, which are to be in his presence and to remain in his presence through the vehicle and through the instrument of his great leadership. Now, in the next video, we're going to take a look at two more Psalms, Psalm 22 and Psalm 23, two favorites, and I'll show you how they are connected as well.